Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal, coming to you from Land Down Under. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today on Rune Soup, we speak to Joshua Cutchin, author of Trojan Feast and player of weird and unpopular musical instruments. Joshua, thank you very much for your time.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure to be on one of my favorite podcasts.
Well, that's really kind. It also means you know what question number one is, Josh. Were you a weird kid?
I've given this some thought, and I think that I've heard numerous responses to this, and I think that I fell into that category who was a kid who was weird but didn't really realize how weird they were because their world just seemed this is the way that the world should work.
Well, to be fair, like I'm looking at your Skype picture right now, and you are playing a reasonably unpopular instrument. So, is that the kind of thing you meant? You were literally dancing to your own drum beat?
Yeah, well, it's almost like I self-selected for ostracization, you know.
Yeah.
Being a self-chosen tuba player, you know, as a young child, I was into dinosaurs and monster movies, which is probably the genesis for how I wound up doing some of the things that I do now.
Favorite monster movie?
Favorite monster movie? The first one I ever saw was the 1933 King Kong.
Oh, very nice.
And one of my first words was dinosaur. I couldn't say dinosaur, so I just came out with dinosaur. But you know, I was the 5-year-old who, you know, knew the scientific names of animals and that sort of thing. And who would just, you know, pop an encyclopedia off the shelf. And luckily enough, I had parents who were very supportive and still remain very supportive of my odd occult leanings, as it is. Southern Christian family, but very much open to all sorts of things. I mean, I've been, you know, thinking about what ancestor worship means in Southern Christian society, and my family was definitely one of these families that wants to hold on to every single heirloom. You know, I have my grandfather's cufflinks that I wear. I'm sitting at my grandfather's desk with the top of its pane of glass from his house. So we're very much into that sort of idea of preserving the past. And you know, my parents have always been really open to a lot of different ideas. I was just at home a couple of weeks ago, and my father's going through his daily devotional, but it's a daily devotional that's accompanied by Native American tribal prayers, which is not something that I think you'd see on the desk of a lot of Southern Christians in the United States.
So, what flavor of Christianity is that? Are you telling me you grew up in some kind of wacko cult?
No. My mother always says, United Church of Christ by birth, Methodist by marriage, and Episcopalian by choice. So with the American branch of the Anglican Church, in the U.S., which really, you know, obviously is a good fit for people who are into a lot of different disciplines. You know, I'm always reminded of the fact that Rupert Sheldrake is a practicing member of the Episcopal Church in England as well, and I just still do have a Christian affiliation, even though it's become the sort of syncretic cafeteria style Christianity that I practice nowadays.
Well, you know, with you have a reasonable understanding of history, so Christianity has always done that.
Yeah, and you know, I think that being interested in the things that I am, I mean, my father-in-law is a Baptist preacher, a Southern Baptist preacher, who I'm still bewildered by the fact that he knows about what I do and doesn't, you know, damn me to hell every night in his prayers. But I do think that being involved and interested in these sort of, you know, fringe subjects as we are, I do have to live with a little bit of cognitive dissonance, but I think if I live with that dissonance and I acknowledge it, then I kind of am in the clear in some way. Because I'm, you know, it's sort of what we talked about the other night, this very Patrick Harper idea of things being true in the sense of being, you know, something that is a fundamental universal truth, but not being, you know, literally true. Like a romantic film can be the most true thing you've ever seen. It can be heartbreaking and the emotions can be very real, but the actual telling of the story isn't a literal truth. So that's sort of where I've come to fall today in my own spirituality.
That makes sense. I mean, did you grow up properly Christian? Like, were you off to church every Sunday, that kind of thing, as well as learning about dinosaurs?
Yes, yeah, pretty much. And it's something that I maintained throughout my collegiate years. Actually, oddly enough, I've probably been going to church the least since I've married my wife, because Christian churches in small town Georgia can be very difficult to find a fit. Let's just say that.
No, yeah, we completely understand. So from dinosaurs, I mean, let's stick with that for a minute. If you were in a family that had a spirituality that they were practicing, and you're in the South, which has its own kind of unconscious magical architecture. Anyway, I mean, did you live in a haunted house? Were there any kind of odd experiences that started to get you down the track of being interested in interesting things like UFOs and boring things like Bigfoot?
Well, I think this is another one of those questions where a lot of people who would say no haven't really taken a step back and looked at their life. I mean,
can I just interrupt there to agree
certainly.
And say, why do you think I ask the question of every guest?
Exactly. In my case, there are certain things that my parents have mentioned in the past that I've been like, oh yeah, I completely forgot about that. One of my favorite things that I like to bring up is when my parents were adding on to their house, which they still live in. They've lived in for 30 some odd years. I was about 10 years old, and we would find stacks of quarters all around the house, inside the house and out in the construction area. And they would always be in very odd places. We found a stack of, the quarters were always in fours, so always, $1. And we, like, for example, one of the weirdest places that we saw was we took down the dictionary, which we hadn't taken down this particular dictionary in probably 3 years. And there was a stack of 4 quarters behind it. And that really does sort of, I mean, I don't think that there was, my mom didn't do it. I feel like she would have come out by now. And unless there was some sort of wily contractor, hiding quarters behind places in the house and in random places, it almost has this sort of to use a Gordon Whiteism, sort of a mouthfeel of fairy folk phenomena.
Yeah, or flat out ghosts.
Yeah. So in terms of what's happened in the house, like it's not a haunted house at all. I really think that I've since I left home, I've had a little bit of odd, what I would qualify as typically ghost phenomena. But it's never been anything. I'm definitely one of these people who I find it very easy to write things off. So there wasn't like this catalyst moment that a lot of people involved in the occult or Forteana can really cite, as sort of the catalyst for how they wound up here. I think it really was just sort of an outgrowth of me being into monsters, because I would bring home, books on Bigfoot and books on UFOs from the library on a regular basis. And, again, that was encouraged. My parents had the attitude of, hey, at least he's reading. So I have to say that's sort of just an outgrowth of that. It all sort of snowballed into itself.
Yeah, there's sort of several roads into that kind of occult Fortean world, and one of them is simply the accumulation of data. Like, you can actually look at it and go, well, there's something here. You can kind of think your way into it. That way, in Chaos Protocols, I was actually explaining this to my father a couple of weeks ago, who's a psychiatrist and one of those people with, hilariously for a psychiatrist, some sort of dissociative approach to the supernatural, because we have lived in a haunted house, or he has, and he grew up as a small child in New Guinea, and there was weird things there, and my mother's been friends with all kinds of crazy psychics and things over the years, so he's been at the coalface of some things that people would consider fairly impressive, which he just keeps pushing from his mind because he's just kind of not wired that way. But the sort of ancestor chapter, which goes into things like the Society for Psychical Research and NDE research and all that kind of stuff, and you actually can think yourself via an analysis of the data into a position where you begin to take these things seriously.
Well, that's what sort of makes it so tragic that so much of academia hasn't been able to think themselves into accepting some of these things that, I mean, as we've talked about before, I mean, are very quite easily falsified. Materialism, I think, if you really are following the data to its logical conclusion, there's a lot of problems with this system, and so what you sort of wind up with somebody like me who hasn't had a lot of experiences to believe their eyes or their ears or whatever, and yet is paying attention. We wind up in this sort of liminal state where we don't feel like we belong to anybody in some sense.
And picking the story back up from childhood, then going from the kid who brought UFO and Bigfoot books home from the library. And I mean, did you go off to tuba college after that? Was it always at some stage were you thinking, nah, did you want to be a writer, or did you get to a point where I'm like, I have a sufficient amount of information to begin covering an area of the sort of Fortean spirit world, whatever you want to call it, that has not really been looked at in a rigorous way?
Yeah, so this particular aspect that I'm immersed in nowadays, the whole Fortean thing, really sort of remained dormant for a long time. I mean, it was always there in the background, but yeah, I was also the sort of kid who would rattle off 80 pages of fiction just to have something to write about. Usually fan fiction, which I'm not proud of, but every one of my
what kind
mentors,
of fan fiction? You can't just leave that out there. Come
man,
on,
Gordon, come on,
Ghostbusters, Transformers. What are we doing?
Star Wars fan fiction.
Oh, fair enough.
And Alien fan fiction and Predator fan fiction.
Yeah,
big fan.
Space
20th
stuff.
Century Fox monsters. Yeah, space stuff. Yeah, basically. I think there was some Indiana Jones fan fiction in there too. But all my mentors and all my teachers always encouraged me to go to school to write. The only person who encouraged me to go to school for music was my band director, and I did show. I feel like looking back on it now, I sort of leapfrogged in to musical development ahead of people, and I sort of showed a certain ease of aptitude. I mean, it was one of those things where I liked it more because it was easy than because it really stoked my fire. I sort of learned to really enjoy it to the degree that I do today. But I did. I ended up going to college at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Tuba College, where I received a very happy education, and I ended up coming down to the University of Georgia to get my master's degree. And it was sometime down here that it made a lot more sense to me to... So I love and I appreciate classical music so much. But there is a very... You hear about classical musicians tend to weep and gnash their teeth about dwindling audiences. But most classical musicians that I know aren't doing a lot of audience outreach, and they're not doing a lot to engage with audiences. And you look at the model, and the model is, with the exception of chamber music, if you're looking at orchestras, it's quite a large number of personnel, and it almost seems unsustainable. And I ended up going in the jazz rock tuba area, which I'm very thankful for my classical education. It has allowed me to do things that I don't think I would have been able to if I hadn't followed that path. But having said that, I've made more money playing jazz tuba than I ever did classical tuba. So if there are any tuba players listening, which is probably unlikely, but if there are...
the big bucks are in jazz.
The big bucks are in jazz. Go get yourself a sousaphone. It'll be the best $4,000 you've ever spent, and it'll pay for itself within a year. So yeah, I found a sort of a niche in this jazz rock tuba thing, and I think sometimes that it sort of scratches that community neural network sort of itch. I don't think it's coincidental that a lot of my classical musician friends tend to be at best agnostic, at worst staunch atheists, and my jazz rock friends tend to be more spiritual. I think that when you're doing improvisational forms of music, you do tap into this sort of neural network. And classical musicians are so obsessed with what's on the page that they really shut themselves out to the community that's around them whenever they're making music in a lot of ways. I mean, yes, again, coming back to something like chamber music, there are nuances that people pick up on, but it's not that sort of, oh my gosh, we all switched the groove at the same time. How did that happen? Sort of thing that happens when you're involved in more improvisatory art forms.
Well, jazz is literally magic. It emerged at the same time as some of the, native North American magics like hoodoo and so on. It literally is from the same pot.
No, exactly, and I it's sort of weird because I I mean being a tuba player who wants to do sort of jazz stuff, like 90% of what I do is New Orleans influenced. Um, and I've always, for whatever reason, I've had a very strong interest in voodoo and hoodoo, which that reminds me, I need to send you my second album because if you just look at the if you look at the artwork and the titles, you can tell that there's definitely that influence that going on there. And so, in terms of my own personal journey, I feel like I'm sort of evolving to something more like that. I've got another project that's getting ready to get off the ground, which is a tuba voodoo blues swamp rock band, which is going to really scratch that itch for me, I think, in a lot of ways, because I really do appreciate the pageantry of all that in a lot of ways. I'm not sure if that's disingenuous to not be a practitioner and to still enjoy the pageantry, but it definitely speaks to me on some level.
I think that's a very good way of describing it, and I think if you're self-aware enough to kind of question the disingenuity or not, I think you'll be fine. I mean, it is. The pageantry is very appealing. That kind of Southern processional band American Gothic thing is lovely.
And you can't escape it in a lot of ways. I mean, so I grew up in North Carolina, which is sort of pushing the edge of the South. It's not necessarily even the deep South. But the farther south you go, and the farther into that Mississippi Delta you go, the harder it is to escape. And it's pervasive, and it feels old and earned in a way that Christianity doesn't down here. And I say that as a Christian. It feels like it almost. I don't know many disciplines in the American South that command respect from non-practitioners, if that makes any sense. And I think that, especially among the Christian community, it's like, hey, that's you do your thing, respect it. Let's stay on opposite sides of the street because I really do think that there's some power in what you're doing, and you do see that with voodoo and hoodoo in the South in America.
Well, that's good. That's as for the experience of the potency of the performative aspect of it. I mean, it feels more powerful than Christianity, realistically, because it's older. We were talking yesterday about the fact that Göbekli Tepe is essentially a guitar. It is a musical instrument that you stand in. So we don't know what and there's one entrance in. So there is a procession of some description, realistically, mostly drums, that would have gone on. But we have these archaeological footprints to show that this performative use of percussion and music is, really, really old, and whatever contemporary structure it shows up in, you still feel that antiquity and that primal component to it.
Yeah, which, I mean, again, with a lot of these New Orleans music traditions, I mean, the whole idea of gathering in Congo Square to have your ceremonies, it just naturally, well, it does what New Orleans does best. It bleeds into itself, and it mixes, and it synthesizes into its own sort of thing.
Absolutely. All right, so jumping to the book. I mean, how did you go from tuba college to your, well, is it your first book? Is Trojan Feast your first book?
It is. Mm-hmm.
So tell me the story of the genesis of that idea, because it is it's a great book, but it's also an area that I think a lot of people, when it came out, expressed surprise that no one had actually sat down and done like book-length diligence on this corner of the field.
Yeah, well, it's amazing what you find inside yourself when you're in a desk job. So I ended up working after graduating with 2 master's degrees from the University of Georgia, one in music and one in journalism. I wound up working for the School of Music, and I wound up working in the public affairs capacity of the School of Music. I have a lot of great friends there. It's a wonderful institution, but at the end of the day, in that capacity, it's like having 60 bosses, because every faculty member's whim is sort of, you have to jump. And there's some that are very respectful of your time and say, can you do this? And those are the ones that you make time for. And there are others who say, do this. And you're like, you know what? I'm going to put this on the back burner. So a series of events sort of coalesced to inspire me to write this book. The first one was that I was sort of going through what I would refer to as a musical doldrum. I wasn't really doing as much playing. I had a band that had been pretty successful and had just quit. I didn't know where to pick up the pieces. I didn't know how to pick up the pieces. So I was looking for something that, in a lot of ways, that I could control myself and not have to rely on any other people to lift the entire project going in a certain direction. So that happened about the same time that I had gotten a book called Raincoast Sasquatch by J. Robert Alley. Now, I know that a lot of people don't care about Sasquatch outside of the States. But it was the moment when I read this one line that said that among some First Nations tribes in North America, that to take food from a bookwuss, which was their name for a woodman or a Sasquatch, meant that you would be trapped with them forever and become one of them. And that was the moment when I said, you know what? In the best tradition of Auric Goldfinger from the James Bond novels, what is it? Once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, three times is enemy action. And I'd seen that sort of thing so many times, this idea of this food taboo, most prominently in fairy folklore, especially the Celtic folklore, that if you were to take food from fairies, you would be trapped in fairyland forever. And it made me wonder if there was perhaps something going on at a deeper level. And then, of course, you look at other areas of Fortean, and you see similar motifs. I mean, there isn't an explicit food taboo in alien abduction, but at the same time, people say that they're given something to eat or drink, oftentimes in a short period of time where they wouldn't necessarily need that for sustenance. So I said, I wonder if there's something here. And so a friend of mine, Mike Clellan, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him.
I am indeed.
Okay, so yeah, Mike, when he was writing his owl book, so that synchronicities and these sort of things that these trends that you see are like a thread that you've got to pull on, and the more you pull on it, the more thread comes out, and everything just ends up unraveling. And it really was sort of the way with this, because you look at this and you have to say, well, is there an intersection between the unexplained and food and sleep paralysis? Is there an intersection between the occult and food and sexuality? And so you end up sort of building out this entire spider web of different topics that you thought were never connected. Now, of course, a year after discovering Rune Soup, shout out to my friend Aaron David, who has a podcast, Charm the Water, who turned me on to you for the first time. A year after discovering this sort of world of magic and taking it in a serious way that I hadn't previously, which is, shame on me. I feel like there are like 3 missing chapters from the book now, because I feel like, that could really provide some additional insight. So hopefully someday there will be a revised and expanded version where I talk about spirit offerings and food.
Well, I'm going to break down some of the topic areas of the book, and then that's probably going to be the discussion we have towards the end. But what interested me, I mean, when I think I would have heard about the book, it might have been Mysterious Universe. I don't know if you went on that one before you went on Banal. But
so
I
my
found
mom
out about the book.
By the book?
Yeah. I found out about the book from a podcast. So I'm like, no, that's really clever. I'm surprised people haven't looked at that as an idea. So obviously I grabbed it. Let's talk about some of the areas that you research in the book, and then we can kind of talk about deep structure towards the end. So you mentioned fairies. Let's talk fairies and food.
Yeah, so it's as I had mentioned, it's this really well-known food taboo that if you were to take food from fairyland, you would be trapped there forever. Now, of course, the interesting thing is that doesn't seem to hold true. I mean, there are tales of people who do take food from fairyland and are fine, or people who take food in fairyland and emerge. Often, the sort of rule of thumb is if they think that they've been in fairyland for a year, they emerge an hour later, and if they think they've been in there for an hour, they emerge a year later. But sometimes after taking food in fairyland, they won't have anything happen to them until they actually exit, and then they'll crumble into dust or something along those lines. But you find this motif in a lot of different cultures. Anthropologists will say that it's a variation on the Persephone myth, where she was taken to the underworld and commanded and Hades was commanded to release her, but before she left, he gave her a cursed pomegranate seed. She ate the pomegranate seed and was doomed to remain in the underworld forever. Which sounds like a good explanation for how it could diffuse across the Eurasian continent. But it doesn't quite seem to explain to me how widespread this is. I mean, you find Maori beliefs that express similar ideas. You find, again, as I mentioned, a lot of First Nations people in North America as well. I wonder, after having not trying to turn the tables here, but I wonder, having read Starships, if there's any sort of a motif that is as pervasive into the older families of myths, like the Laurasian myths and whatnot. I wonder if there's any sort of motif of the food taboo in those.
Well, I would say it would go earlier to the Gondwana area. When anthropologists say like it's a variation of a Persephone myth, it's quite a circular thing to say because, well, what triggered the initial myth? If it all descends from the single myth of this happening, that's, I can trace that. Dr. Witzel can trace that, and so yeah, you've made a reasonable assertion that the similarities in the kind of structure of certain food taboos spread out across the world indicate that they likely emerged from the last time these different peoples were kind of genetically in the same area, and that's the Laurasian story. Mm-hmm. Fine. Why did it happen in the first place? And that's always interested me about the kind of circular explanatory things you will hear anthropologists say.
Yeah, and it doesn't. It's answers are not always explanations.
No, exactly.
And so that's a good example of something that I think is an answer, but it's not a satisfactory explanation. So what I did was I rolled up my sleeves and I said, well, let's see if there are any sort of themes that you can find in this. Because, again, this is something that lots of people have pointed out over the years. Most famously, to my mind, there was a brief mention of it in Passport to Magonia, which, being both of us worshiping at the altar of Valet, certainly has an important role to play in my viewpoints on this subject. But, WWJVD, what would Jacques Vallée do? And so I tried my best to compile as many sources that I could, which is always difficult with a survey of this size, but and to see if there are any real trends that emerged amongst not only fairy folk, but in abduction motifs and in believe it or not, Bigfoot motifs, and to see if there were anything that really emerged, and especially in the fairy folklore, it was startling to me how often it was liquid or bread that was administered. A trend that more or less holds true into alien abduction lore, and in that sort of. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, let's jump in there because I've got the topics are sort of split into bread and liquids. Let's take bread to start with, and you're absolutely right about it moving from fairy folklore to UFO folklore. I think the most famous food stuff in modern UFO folklore is a very boring unleavened pancake.
Yes, it's very true. We're referring to Joe Simonton, correct?
We are.
One of my favorite cases, sort of the poster child for this phenomena, and the one that Vallée mentioned in Passport to Magonia, an chicken farmer from Eagle River. I was about to say an eagle farmer from Chicken River.
That would have made it way more awesome.
It would. A chicken farmer from Eagle River, Wisconsin, by the name of Joe Simonton, was making breakfast on the morning of April 18th, 1961. It was just before noon, and he heard a strange sound outside that sounded like, he said, like radials on wet pavement. And he looked outside, and there was this object. I'm not going to say craft because I don't necessarily feel like that's a correct interpretation. But there was an object that looked like two bowls placed lip to lip, big and shiny. And he said that he could see three, and this is my favorite description ever from Midwestern farmer, three dark-skinned Italians inside. And he said each was about 5 feet tall and dressed with these sort of dark outfits and this knitted headgear. And one of them was waving this jug in the air. And I also love like the earnestness with which he acts for the rest of the story. He thinks, oh, they must need water. So Simonton, according to his account, goes outside, takes this jug, brings it back in, fills it up with water, and when he returns it, he sees that one of the other entities is flipping some sort of either pancakes or cookies. You can hear them described in various ways on some sort of flameless griddle. And they noticed him noticing, and they actually ended up giving him 4 of these things, which they're about I think 3 inches in diameter. They're porous, and he had them, and he actually was able to produce them. So in a lot of ways, this is the case, because it's one that, hey, look, there's actually some physical evidence. So he gave one to J. Allen Hynek. He gave one to the National Investigation Committees on Aerial Phenomena, NICAP. He gave one to a local judge, and he kept one for himself. And he said that they tasted awful. And when they were investigated, it was revealed that there was actually completely mundane ingredients. I believe it was buckwheat flour, hydrogenated oil, and buckwheat flour. And like I said, he said that they tasted awful. There are some rumors that I've heard since I wrote this book that supposedly one of the Simonton pancakes is in a glass display case in the cafeteria of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which I don't think has any real validity to it, but I love just adding that in there as a little tag. But again, thinking about sort of the way that these phenomena tend to reference each other, I want to see if there was any sort of precedent for this in fairy lore, because even if it's not the same phenomena, which I sort of suspect that it is, not saying that fairies are aliens or aliens are fairies, but even if it's not the same phenomena, it definitely uses similar methods, or it's 2 faces on a single coin or something. I'm not really sure, but I wanted to look and see if there was any sort of real precedent for this bizarre tale of pancakes, and I actually found out that there are some Dutch traditions where these entities called the Underbanski, another version of the fairy folk, would actually visit farmers in the fields and provide them with fresh water and pancakes. So it's interesting. I would love to. I didn't do my due diligence on this, but I would love to find out if Simonton's heritage had some Dutch roots, because it sort of speaks to the possibility that this is the way that the phenomena is choosing to speak to him through his ancestry.
Which is probably a line of inquiry worth following, given that, speaking of Jacques Vallée, he worked out, and it's kind of creepy as to why this would be the case, but the persistence of fairy phenomena is more likely to be associated with people who are genetically Northwest European, in particular Irish and sort of Brittany, and to a lesser extent Northeast Spain.
Yes, and I would also, I think I would be sort of remiss if I didn't point out that there are certain states in the U.S. that tend to smell a little bit high stranger than others. And I would sort of, my go-to for that would be, New York, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin in a lot of ways. There are a lot of strange things that happen in Wisconsin, a lot of strange phenomena that I think tend to cluster there in that sort of upper Midwest area.
No, for sure. One of the things when I first encountered the pancake story was thinking about it from a magical perspective. One of the reasons it tasted disgusting was it had no salt, which is a very fairy thing. Like salt is something you don't put in fairy food. Exactly.
In addition to other sort of prophylactics against the fairy folk, you had iron would be another thing. You could carrying a piece of iron or nailing a piece of iron above your door would ward off the fairy folk. Salt is definitely one of those things, which again, it's interesting. And if you look at the survey of the phenomena as a whole, I mean, I could count on one hand the number of cases that I encountered where somebody said something tasted salty. In fact, a lot of times people would remark, "Oh, it needed salt," or it needed some seasoning or something. Which again is a nice little parallel.
Well, it does point to, which we'll get to. It points to, however, whatever the fuck is going on has some kind of deep structure underneath. UFO phenomena, ritual magic in the West. Fairy folk and so on, because there are unexpected continuities, and that's one of them. I mean, the bread thing I find fascinating. We were talking about Dr. Irving Finkel's work to do with the earliest versions of the Noah myth yesterday, and actually I can point to that show because by the time this one comes out, golden. So we were talking about that, and one of the things I find fascinating about, in particular, bread and its association with extra-dimensional exchange, like what was going on there, is at least half of it, perhaps on our side, I think is a memory of domestication and agriculture at its origins and where that came from across North Africa. Did you watch the Michael Pollan series Cooked?
No, I did not.
It's on Netflix. It's worth getting because he's talking to. He goes to North Africa, and the episode about bread and so on, talking to sort of North African Muslims, but it's that sort of version of Islam, like Christianity, that's a bit blended with its landscape, and so there are stories that have come in from elsewhere, and bread becomes a symbol of the universe because it has 4 elements in it. You have the actual flour, which is earth. You have the water, which is in it. And as a result of the sort of fermentation, because it's in the fermentation episode, that you get the air bubbles in it. And of course, it requires fire to make. So one of the ritual reasons for the prominence of bread, that's all, after agriculture, that's basically all we ate for 8,000 years. So right. There's that side of it. But at the same token, it has in cultures and understanding that it is microcosmically significant, and that's why it becomes a gift from God, because it's this little world, it's a little map of the universe that sustains you. And
it's almost this sort of alchemical ideal, of all
the alchemy thing. This is what I found interesting about it being a North African kind of Muslim way of seeing the bread. I mean, it's been a very long time since I read the Quran. I read it as a 17-year-old, so because as you do, I don't recall it being in there. It just struck me as something that may have been absorbed from the landscape instead, given that it's essentially right next door to Egypt, and that's where we get alchemy from. So I just wonder if it's not. You start to think, okay, well, that's interesting as a memory of where bread came from, because if you look at the sort of process of domestication of einkorn wheat, which is in the area around Göbekli Tepe, within a millennia of the site being used. First of all, we probably made beer, so we just kind of crushed up this wild grass called einkorn and turned it into beer, which we presumably steeped mushrooms in. That's Dr. Klaus Schmidt's kind of read of what went on there, because otherwise all the food we ate at Göbekli Tepe was wild taxa. It was all animals that had been out to be hunted. So it's a weird combination. Unless they're having, auroch sandwiches, it seems like they were having roast beef, like roast meat, and a hallucinogenic beer. But if you look at the process, it must have been very strange at the very beginning of agriculture to have a grass that you take the seed heads from and then crush up and then add with water, and then you can live on it forever once you apply fire. It is something that you can, either it did come from the spirit world, or it would look like it came from the spirit world. It would look like pure magic. And there's something about bread in particular, which is probably the most prominent motif food-wise in all of these phenomena, that seems to me like it's a fuzzy memory of that initial kind of extra-dimensional skills transfer.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's not coincidental, sort of tying back into that so many major mythologies tie bread into not only sort of having a divine origin, but also tied into our origins, and our own origins. But if you look at what the definition of sort of what this book is about, it's about the food from the other. And really, if the tradition is that the food came from the other, then we don't even need to have some sort of experience. We just need to go down to the supermarket, and that the bread is sort of a food of the other. And it's one of those things. I'm talking about the domestication of grain. It's one of those things that I feel is a lot like how we smell. Like, it's one of those things that nobody really understands how it happens, and nobody seems really motivated to get to the bottom of how it happened. So we're just going to sort of come up with this sort of vague idea and say, well, it must have happened in some sort of very sensible materialist way, and move on. To pack our bags and move on.
Yeah, and as we ignore it, we still have this range of myths, and in some cases, like the eagle farmer from Chicken Valley, you have, even if we do ignore it, sitting in between the worlds, if you will, is this curious exchange of, because what fascinates me about Fairy food lore is, on our side, we would leave food out for them. So we're actually in an exchange process as well, and there are very specific rules about it, which strikes me as a continuity worth paying attention to.
Well, yeah, it's exactly like it's sort of like, again, the conversation we had recently talking about, the protocols for magical practice. It does seem sort of like it sort of feels a little bit like that in terms of, you can do this if you want to, but you might regret the fact that you did it in this way. You should really do it in the proper way, the proper sort of offering being given. I mean, the fairy folk, with that sort of end of the exchange, the from us to them, it was very important to make sure that your offering was entity specific or is fairy specific. Certain regions of the world and certain fae folk had certain things that they preferred, and you wouldn't give. I mean, even in areas that had multiple versions of fae folk, you wouldn't give them all the same thing. Brownies liked milk, but pixies wanted bread. And these were very specific things that you should follow if you wanted to avoid their wrath. It's it's interesting to me. Again, I don't think so. The book is fairies, aliens, and Sasquatch, and it becomes clear the further you get into it that Sasquatch is doing something a little bit different. There are similarities there, but it's doing something a little bit different. But I do think it's really interesting that there's this ridiculous supposed trend of habituation, which is this notion that some people claim that they are giving food to Sasquatch, and they're leaving out offerings, and they're receiving things in return, like a polished river rock, or one of my favorite accounts is someone who supposedly left out a bag of apples or something and got mice woven into little grass packets, which, I mean, it seems like one of those flaws because people assume that this is Sasquatch phenomena, but it really, I mean, if you don't see a Sasquatch, then it doesn't mean it was a giant 8-foot tall hairy humanoid. It smells just like fairy folklore. A similar thing that's happening that I don't necessarily touch on in the book, but people still in certain parts of America will find horses braids maned. Now, like the eagle farmer from Chicken River, they'll find horses' manes braided overnight. And of course, to the modern American mindset, well, it must have been Bigfoot. But if you look back at, centuries of tradition, that was a very fairy thing to do.
No, absolutely. And that we're going to get to it, the sort of ongoing extra-dimensional exchange. If you look at the role of, it's a politically problematic word, but I'm going to use it. If you look at the role of a shaman in traditional or pre-modern or even contemporary animist cultures, the majority of his or her time is spent essentially, it's almost a trading floor role, essentially making sure the local spirit world is okay with the tribe. You see them in New Guinea kind of doing things like walking the bounds and making sure everything's all good, and out of that, and if it's not, correcting it. So offerings or banishings or so on, and this is, and all of a sudden not all of a sudden, but these things seem to have survived in a lot of the European agrarian cultural folklore, which is, as you say, like certain fairy beings like milk, certain other ones like this. If it's something that we're doing purely as a psychological expression of our lack of understanding of the natural world, then it seems unlikely that it would have shaken down into some very specific things that people like.
Yes. And, this sort of, I think that the idea of context is important in all of this. It's a very sort of valet idea to say it looks like fairy phenomena and alien phenomena could perhaps be the same thing. But if you think about the way that these offerings might have been observed as well, one generation's alien with a pill is another generation's fairy with a wafer. Or a cracker or something. And I think that putting it in that sort of perspective as well, filtered through time and sort of realizing that place has as much place and time and temporal place, so to speak, has as much of an important role to play in this as anything else.
Well, yeah, so let's move to sort of liquids and pills and into a 20th century view of UFOs as aliens, and how it seems likely that this sort of macro structure of extra-dimensional exchange has continued or perpetuates itself.
So in addition to bread, you'll find a bunch of liquids, and of course in fairy lore this was often milk or an ale or wine, because ale and wine, simply by the process by which they were generated, were more sanitary than other options that people had to quench their thirst. But what I found really fascinating was the fact that even in modern alien abduction lore, people aren't, with any degree of frequency, getting horrible tasting, unidentifiable liquids. A lot of times it's a fruit juice, or, and of course this might be just a point of comparison among witnesses, assuming that there's sort of any objective reality to these things. But it seems to me like there are very earthly things being offered in these examples. And so you have to also sort of look at not only that, which raises a ton of questions, but you also have to look at sort of the symbolism that this might entail. You think about the depiction of, for one, the depiction of the alien and the other in pop culture. The X-Files had this ongoing black oil monster that was sort of this literal liquid alien that appeared and reared its head over several seasons. You've got to look at stories where people are covered in some sort of gel, or they're immersed in some sort of liquid. And other examples, there are plenty of other examples where entities seem to have some sort of mercurial liquid-like connotation, which opens up some interesting questions, I think, about exactly what's being offered. Because if you want to settle on anything, it's that this is not to calm a grumbly stomach. People are being given something, or at least the appearance of something, to initiate some sort of effect.
Well, and when I was reading that part of the book, the thing that occurred to me was, if you look at the depictions of the Ankh in Egyptian tomb art or temple art, the gods are forcing them into the mouth of the king or whoever's tomb it happens to be. So they're actually putting this, it's consumption that leads to consumption of something is required for this transformational process.
Yes, and it's an internalization of something that leads to some sort of enlightenment, I think is a good way to put it, which of course leads us down to, and I hope that my hands aren't on the wheel too much here, but I think that naturally sort of leads the discussion to the subject of entheogens, which often, like we were mentioning with bread, have this storied history of being a gift from the other to allow us to interact with the other.
Well, absolutely, and I think they sit there in the sort of flavored beer beginnings of agriculture, which does sort of suggest to be an opening of a crack between the worlds, and especially as we started to get competency in harvesting grain, which we did to get off our faces first, because beer is more fun than bread. But it was in the course of doing that and flavoring it with hallucinogenic mushrooms, or not even flavoring it, just, soaking them, that we moved up to the next level. We actually said, okay, let's do bread and let's do what have you. And it just seems that there are these pieces. There is something about improved engagement with the spirit world that has a offerings on both sides component to it. It's extra-dimensional diplomacy, essentially.
Well, it's not only is it that, but it's also communion. to use a very laden word amongst people with a ufological bent. The idea that to be with something is to actually to commune with something is to actually sort of be accepted as part of the tribe, as it were. Which really, sort of does suggest the fact that, or no, for me it sort of confirms in a lot of ways the fact that we are tied up in this other, and we have more in common with it than we don't. Which also, again, tends to shoot down, in my opinion, nuts and bolts ETH hypothesis.
Yeah, it does. And one of the things I thought was interesting in the book, as you sort of move through the different, subsections of Magonia, so fairies, Bigfoot, UFOs, and so on, you land on some effectively dietary implications of this research.
Yes, sorry, I had my finger was on the pause button, on the mute button, and I was yelling at it, and nothing happened. Yes, I really did stumble into this particular aspect of it, because if you look at the survey that you come up with, you sort of wind up with a so what. So the results of it are, liquids are very prominent, especially fruit juices. Breads are very prominent. Fruits and vegetables are very prominent. Another liquid that has some degree of prominency is milk or milk analogs. And then everything else really sort of does taper off from there. And you would have to think that with the preponderance of cases that I examined in Western society, that if this was wish fulfillment, you would see people talking about meat and candy, because that's one thing that we're obsessed with is sugar and meat. So what does that mean? Is there any sort of deeper meaning that you could graft onto that? And I was sort of fascinated with the idea of humors, and the idea that in a classical sense, that certain foods could influence humors of the body in certain ways. And I just happened to stumble upon, I'm not even entirely sure how it happened, but I happened to stumble upon the idea of the sattvic diet, which in Ayurvedic healing cuisine is actually the diet that you are supposed to consume, that will lead you to the greatest sense of enlightenment and the greatest sense of balance in your own life. And it feels not coincidental that this diet also corresponds to the diet that seers and mystics should consume. Not only is it one that they prefer to consume, but it also sort of has that quality. And when you map this onto the common and underreported aspect of the post-abduction experience, that is to say, psi phenomena that a lot of people experience, it seems to suggest that there might possibly be a link there. Not that somehow that eating this food necessarily gave them psi qualities, but you've got to look at some of these people who actually have changed their diets after having an experience with the other. I mean, I mentioned earlier how people going into fairyland would be fine sometimes until they came out of fairyland, and then they would crumble into dust. Quite often they would crumble into dust when they sat down to an earthly meal. But in more modern and more easily vettable sources, there are several. There are quite a few accounts of people who come back and sort of have this lacto-vegetarian diet that they adopt. One famous abduction was the Avis couple who were abducted in the 70s in London. And they came back from their experience, and they not only gave up, but also encouraged their friends to give up meats, artificial flavorings, preservatives, sugars, alcohol, all these things that are completely excluded from this idea of the sattvic diet.
Yeah, as you know, we're both Jacques Vallée fans. He kind of goes in and out on it, but a lot of the time he will land on the idea that we don't know what the motives are for whatever's behind the one-way mirror to be engaging with us in the way they are. It is highly manipulative in the sense that it's manipulating culture rather than, showing up in blinding flashes of light. So we're being shaped in some way. The food thing is likely a subset of that, but nevertheless, it almost seems more benign and further along towards communion rather than poisoning, if you will, because the dietary implications, the dietary implications are actually quite good. Like there's a health component to it. We shouldn't be using artificial flavorings. And as Michael Pollan says, eat food, mostly plants, not too much. It's basically how humans should live.
Yes. And it's, it seems like, in terms of the interface, it makes sense that you would want. It makes sense that if you were going to do something so that people felt like there was an effect upon them, you would have food, because none of us put a thing past our lips that we don't expect it to have some sort of effect on us. And I think that it's sort of the perfect vehicle for that sort of manipulation. Now, again, I got to be clear here. I'm not necessarily ascribing any sort of motive to these things. I'm not saying that Space Brothers want us to all be vegan or something like that. But it does seem like there is a message that's, sort of a subcutaneous message in all this.
Yeah, and that's retained, as you say. You have the Sattvic diet. You also have a lot of European mystics. So I think Saint Teresa of Avila wouldn't eat meat. A lot of the monastic orders. So people that have these profound spiritual experiences end up with things that may not be a universal prescription, but is important for them. And the one that fascinates me, which is sort of the book is about food, so there's not a huge amount to do with fasting in there. But fasting is a essential and underused component of spirit contact and mysticism. And I did it. I started doing the intermittent fasting thing 3 or 4 years ago, largely because I worked in food media. So I'm like, if I don't do this, I'll need sticks to walk pretty soon. And I kept doing it because of the dream state that would come on fast days was like nothing you would get, even if you're just eating reasonably healthy. Like the difference between having, a low protein breakfast like an egg and then generally eating salad during the day and a fast day, the actual differences of your dream state were night and day. It's honestly like coming up on mushrooms as you would head into the dream state on a fast day, and you go, there's something. And that's the piece that I've been waiting to put into this, emerging research field of the role of food and consumption of medicine and, in a shamanic sense, and entheogens and so on from, that side of the spirit world and ours. There's sort of this emerging awareness that we do have, there's a structure to it for some reason.
Yes, and it's the sort of thing where this being a first foray, I thought about a lot of these things, but at the end of the day, you got to find some way to get your arms around it. So that's part of the reason that I'd like to expand upon this in the future, because I do think that that there is a lot still here to discuss, and I think fasting is another part of that. I had never really heard until I think it was your Christopher Knowles interview about the impact of fasting on dreaming. But it's interesting. I wonder if there's some sort of uptake or there's something to do with tryptophan production or something along some sort of tryptamine thing going on when you fast. If that possibly has some sort of effect on that. I mean, from a material standpoint.
No, I get what you mean. So, we talk about entheogens, and in some respects, we overemphasize them because they're medicines rather than things you take every day to, maintain spirit contact. The thing that will chemically alter you more than anything else on a daily basis is the food you consume, because you consume several pounds of it, and it's molecules and chemicals, even if you're just eating several pounds of leeks, which would be weird. But the presence of chemicals in your food, natural food, what have you, or the lack of them, is going to chemically alter your body on a daily basis more than anything else.
Yeah, it's the sole. What's the strongest governing factor of our existence, and entheogens are really there. If meditation is the dry way in an alchemical, if meditation is the wet way in an alchemical sense, the slow, steady way of making something happen, then entheogens are really the dry way. They're the rocket ship to the moon, in terms of sort of facilitating that experience.
Yeah, or exercise and surgery. Like it's a medicine.
Right.
One of them is a thing you do every day, and you'll eventually get there, and the other one is. Yeah, especially when it's taken out of context. It's also something that I find interesting. You literally cannot take it every day. When it comes to the naturally occurring ones like psilocybin, you actually can't take it every day, or it won't work.
Yeah, and that's something that's interesting too. Is I think there might even be sort of a potent metaphor there for the way that our body tends, the law of accommodation, the way that our body tends to undercut things that we do, I think there might be a potent metaphor for the way that we interact with the spirit world, in terms of we tend to our bodies and our minds tend to shut things out and to sort of slap a filter on everything.
Well, and if we sort of wind back to what we were talking about yesterday, to the podcast that I will have linked in the show notes, ayahuasca is a very good example of the other side trying to wake us up with the nuclear option, because we potentially have strayed from the more meditational ones. And it's interesting. So I'm now in a town of 1,800 people after London, and there is a change in the dream state here as well. There's less, presumably, EM interference and so on, rather than living in the middle of 10 million people versus 1,800. And you start to... I put these pieces together... I'm not putting them together. I put beside them the entheogen piece and the food piece and the fasting and dream state piece and just the environment that we live in, that we have built in the sense of... electric lighting and EM radiation and Wi-Fi signals and whatever else you want. And you go, well, I guess if you were trying to wake a drowsy world, which, ayahuasca being a medicine that could do that, you do start to see, again, the sensation that there is agency on the other side, and it's not simply a thing that we haven't built this sort of metaphoric cathedral to express the fact that we just really like food.
Well, it's a lot of noise to cut through, and I don't think that it's... I've often thought that, everybody talks about things like liminality and anti-structuralism and the way that people interfere with these other unexplained entities, whatever you want to call them. But I think that might even be making it a little bit too complicated. I mean, you think about the places that these things are seen: lonely roads, in the forest, abandoned haunted houses. These are places that have really been stripped of all the context of modern society. And it doesn't really surprise me that, quote unquote, as awful as the term is, I'm just using this for brevity's sake, primitive peoples have more supernatural experiences, because they don't... I think that there's something about modern life that really just does sort of dampen that. And I look to supplemental or anecdotal rather support for an idea like this. I know that Rosemary Ellen Guiley has suggested that having electronics in your bedroom can keep away jinn, and that some people have, in order to not have night terrors, they keep the TV on. It sort of makes me wonder if we aren't sort of self-limiting in a lot of ways. And it seems like ayahuasca is finding a way to really, I think I mentioned a march to the sea in terms of trying to find a way to cut through all the bullshit.
And marijuana as well. It's interesting. There's a Washington Post article last week that I shared in the Facebook group that's essentially, if you look at the states that have legalized it, the big pharma profits from these just genuinely demonic prescription pain medications have fallen through the floor, because this plant is probably the most medicinal plant humans have ever encountered, and it's another one that's on a tear. It's in a kind of, speaking of monster movies, in an Ian Malcolm sense, life finds a way.
It does. It's almost like, you look at people are finally realizing that they can actually capitalize in a monetary sense on this. It's almost like it's saying, hey, maybe we should try playing at their own game and beating them at their own game. Let's take a capitalist angle to finding a way into society.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I find interesting about the book in general is, so Jacques Vallée spends a lot of time talking about the massaging, manipulation, sort of prodding at culture and the dream state that these phenomena, the Magonian phenomena, seem to do. Dreaming and culture is a thing that you can't not do. And food is the other one. Like, this is something, I remember I was off sick from school one day, and it was in 1980s Australia during the day, there's not a lot of television on. We did get Oprah, and it was an Oprah show, and she was talking to her chef, and she just recently lost weight again, and she's saying food is the most difficult addiction to break because you have to eat it every day. You don't actually have to have heroin every day. It's a very painful process coming off heroin, but with a food addiction, you can't go cold turkey. You have to eat cold turkey at some stage.
Yeah, that's very true. And it's almost like, imagine how hard it would be to get off heroin if, like, this isn't a very good analogy, but, like, imagine how hard it would be to get off prescription painkillers if somebody said, "Oh no, you still have to take Advil every day." Just it's a constant reminder that you're not getting the thing that you really want.
Well, this is what I enjoyed about the book, Josh. It's because the thing about clever ideas, I think, is they seem obvious once they're there, and this just seems like one of those very clever ideas to look at the role of food, because, like culture and dreaming, it's something we have to do every day. And when we look at it in this kind of sober way of saying, okay, well, what is the interface between food and offerings and the spirit world? Yeah, there's this long running and fascinating piece, and you put it next to Vallet's interest in how the Magonian manipulates culture, and you go, oh, look at that. We have some kind of ecosystemic ongoing backwards and forwards right across the things we do every single day and night that is extremely long-lived and probably says something quite important.
Well, I really do appreciate that sentiment. I mean, for me, it was, I'm not suggesting that this was channeled in any sort of way, but it definitely all sort of fell out of me. And, It was one of those moments where I was like, somebody's gonna write about this, right? And I would wait a couple of weeks and say, somebody's gotta, at some point I'm gonna hear about somebody writing about this. And no one ever really did. So I'm like, well, damn it, I guess I better jump in and soil my name for all time. I hope that this is something I am fond of saying a lot, but I feel like in terms of a sense of the way that certain disciplines of Fortean investigation really want to prove things, that they're really sort of missing the point, because in the effort to say there are aliens coming down in nuts and bolts spaceships, or ghosts are the spirits of the dead, or by saying there's a giant hairy man walking around America. In that effort to try to prove that, they're ignoring a lot of these tiny little things that, I don't know, they might be nothing, they might be silly, or there might be something in there that actually gives greater insight. Probably not the answer, but at least a little bit more of a toehold on what is really happening with a lot of these things. So I think that they're, my call to action would be a sort of find the other sense, but less to the point, like introduce yourself to the others. Go after these little things that do seem inconsequential, and try to follow a particular subject for a week, and if it doesn't yield any fruit, it doesn't. But there's going to be something out there that's really going to, I think, turn a lot of things on its head. That's just a matter of people actually taking the time to pay attention to it.
And I 100% agree with the sentiment, because it's sort of what we were discussing, yesterday / in the podcast that's in the show notes. This is the most overused and painful word, and I apologize in advance to everyone listening, but we are at one of those paradigm shift moments where we have new data sets that we need to put underneath phenomenology and the practice of magic and the sort of general Magonian research quest, and the data set. Well, the sort of the beginning of that journey from a food perspective is very much in Trojan Feast. It's a book that, for anyone who is listening, if they're magically operant and they're doing spirit offerings of food and drink and so on, you need the book for historical context and sort of horizontal contemporary context. And for people who listen to the show for Magonian Fortean reasons, you need it because it's a piece of the story that is that needs to be looked at now, and we've got a few of them kind of constellating around. Like I'm still obsessed with Dr. Kripal's The Supernatural book, and so on. So there's a few of these books that represent new data sets from which we can build new hypotheses. And I know a lot of magicians don't like that. Too bad. We're going to have to.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit dumbfounded by that. I appreciate it. Really, I mean, I hope that stuff like this starts a dialogue, and that people start to look at this in a different way, you know, or at least from a different angle.
Yeah, and I hope people who are listening who are magically operant, because we were talking at the beginning of the episode about spirit offerings being the next necessary or logical area of study. If people have these kind of stories, they should get in touch, because it's going to be interesting information. I get every episode, I get wonderful emails from people with anecdotes that kind of match it or so on. But as you say, it's a beginning piece. This all is. It's hopefully day one of kind of a new analytical mode, and I think the data in this book are very useful. So thank you, Josh.
It was a great pleasure. It's a special moment for me. I appreciate that, Gordon.
Very nice. And so people who do want to get in touch or know more and or find the book, what do they do?
Well, I have an ill-maintained blog. I think a blog goes up about once a month at joshuacutchin.com. The book is available in Kindle, paperback, and hardcover from Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And I have a second book that should be coming out this September or October as well.
Nice. And you're on the Twitters?
Yes, I am on the Twitters. Joshua Cutchin, all one word, no underscore. And I tend to be a little bit more active on Twitter than Facebook nowadays.
Splendid. Well, once again, thank you very much. Fascinating conversation.
Thanks so much.
There you have it. Josh Cutchin talking jazz, the South, UFO pancakes, fairy food taboos, plant spirits, offering protocols, and research advice. We recorded this a day or so after I appeared on a podcast Josh co-hosted, which was referenced a couple of times, called Where Did the Road Go? You can find a link to that in the show notes. Offerings and spirit foods are a huge and perennially interesting topic, so if you had something to add, please do head over to runesoup.com or the Runesoup Facebook page. Otherwise, subscribe to the show and or find me on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.